Okay, welcome back. So in this video, we're going to think about the strategy that the authors use to estimate the effect of ban-the-box policies on employment rates for Black, white, and Hispanic young men without college degrees. And in addition to thinking about what they do, we're going to think about some of the potential concerns with their strategy and how they address those concerns. So to start off with, because of the fact that we've got a policy that was implemented in some states and municipalities and not in others, a natural place to start is a difference in difference estimation strategy. In other words, what we might want to do is look at the areas that did pass ban-the-box policies and use areas that didn't pass those policies, but would be expected to have similar changes in employment rates over time as a control group. So essentially, we would compare the changes in the areas that passed the policies to the changes in the areas that didn't pass the policies. Now, in order to do that, though, we're going to run into a pretty serious challenge, which is that instead of having a single area, a single municipality, that passed a policy at a particular point in time, so that we have a clear treatment group and a control group and a clear pre and post period. Instead, what we have is a bunch of different cities and states that pass their policies at different times. So the first challenge we're going to have to come up against is how to generalize a difference in difference estimation strategy to take advantage of all of these different starting points for policies. Second, we're going to think carefully about what common trends assumption we need in order to make this strategy work, and what the biggest concerns might be with that common trends assumption. So this figure here is illustrating what we're talking about here with different start dates for ban-the-box policies in different municipalities. So essentially what the authors have done is they've graphed the states and cities that have ban-the-box policies in each year of their data, starting in 2004 here, and then going to 2005, 2006, 2007, so on and so forth, up to 2014. So the first thing you'll notice here is that different states and cities implemented their policies at different times, but most of the policies went into effect after 2009. So 2014, 13, 12, 11, and 10 see most of the action here, especially in terms of states implementing policies. So this is going to bring us to our first challenge, is how are we going to be able to estimate the effect of a ban-the-box policy in areas like San Francisco and Boston that implemented policies early, and in areas like Minneapolis that implemented policies later. The other challenge is going to be, as with any common trends assumption, right, as with any difference in difference strategy, we're ultimately going to have to believe that we can compare areas that did implement policies to areas that didn't implement policies. And if we look at the cities and states that have policies by 2014, you're going to notice that most of them are going to be in larger cities, coastal areas, and in cities and states that are generally controlled by the Democratic Party. There's some exceptions, right? So for example, Nebraska has a ban-the-box policy, which is a rural state that's generally controlled by Republicans. But for the most part, we're going to be comparing urban and coastal areas to less urban and more conservative areas. All right, so let's start out by thinking mechanically about how to implement something like a difference in difference estimation strategy when we have a bunch of different cities, all of which started ban-the-box policies at different times. And to make this a little simpler, instead of thinking about 10 different years and 100 different cities, let's simplify this to just 3 years and 3 cities. So let's imagine that we had data from 2004, 2008, and 2012, and we had data from Houston, San Francisco, and LA. So let's say that we had San Francisco ban-the-box in 2005, LA banned in 2010, and Houston never. So to start with, we'll simplify even further by ignoring LA. So if we just had Houston and San Francisco, and we wanted to estimate the effect of ban-the-box, we would do something like this, right? We would say employment for person I in your T is going to be a constant, beta naught, plus, let's say, beta SF times whether that person lives in San Francisco, plus beta P times whether the year is post 2005, plus, say, beta 3 times SF times post, and then plus an error, right? So this is just the difference in difference estimation equation we've seen over and over again, where we're going to have dummy variable for whether you're in the treated city, right? A dummy variable for whether you're in the post period, and an interaction between whether you're in the treated city and whether and in the post period. And so if we think about this using our table, right? If we've got our 3 years here, 2004, 2008, and 2012, and our 2 cities, Houston and San Francisco, right? We're going to say that our guess about the value of beta naught is going to be the average employment in Houston in 2004, right? Our equation is going to guess that that someone who's in Houston is going to be employed at a rate beta naught. If they're in San Francisco in 2004, it's going to be beta naught plus beta SF, right? Houston in 2008, now we're post 2005, so it would be beta naught plus beta P, right? And San Francisco in 2008, beta naught plus beta P plus beta SF plus beta 3, right? And we'll have the exact same predictions here in 2008 and in 2012. And so as a result, right, the difference between average employment in Houston and San Francisco in the pre-period is going to be equal to beta SF, right? The difference in employment in 2008 between Houston and San Francisco is going to be estimated by beta SF plus beta 3, as will in 2012. And so our difference in difference, right, beta 3, is going to be the difference between the change in employment in Houston from 2004 to the average of 2008 and 2012, and the change in employment in San Francisco from 2008 to the average of 2008 and 2012, right? So our beta 3 is going to estimate the effect of band the box by comparing the change in employment in San Francisco over all the years in the post period to the change in employment in Houston over all the periods of the post period. Okay, so far, this is all stuff that we're pretty familiar with, right? That we've seen a bunch of times before. But now I'm going to make a couple of modifications to this that aren't going to change anything about this estimation, but are going to allow us to add more cities to this framework. So the first thing that I'm going to do is, instead of saying beta 3 times the interaction of SF and post, right, times an indicator variables that's equal to 1 if you're in San Francisco after 2005, I'm going to rename this BTBIT. And this is going to be equal to 1 if you're in any city that's already implemented band the box, right? So far, when we have San Francisco and Houston as our only cities, we've changed absolutely nothing about this estimation equation by doing this. The second thing that I'm going to do, which is going to be a little bit more intrusive, is instead of just having a single variable here for whether you're post 2005, I'm going to replace that with 2 indicator variables of whether the year is 2008 or whether the year is 2012. So I'm going to say beta 2008 times 2008 plus beta 2012 times 2012. Now, how is that going to change our story here? Well, the result is going to be, in our table here, instead of having beta post, we're going to end up saying in 2008, our guess is going to be beta naught plus beta 2008. Right? Our guess here is going to be beta 2008. And here, our guess is going to be beta naught plus beta 2012. So this is going to change our regression's guess about the employment rate of Houston in 2008 and Houston in 2012, but it's not going to change our difference in difference estimation at all, because the difference between San Francisco's employment and Houston's employment in 2008 is still going to be given by beta SF plus beta 3. Likewise, the difference between San Francisco's employment and Houston's employment in 2012 is still going to be beta SF plus beta 3. So beta 3 is going to have exactly the same interpretation as it did before we modified our regression equation. Now, what's the point of doing all of these changes? The point is going to be, this is going to allow us to add Los Angeles into our data set without changing the structure of our regression. So now, if we have LA, as well as San Francisco and Houston, we can do the following. So now, we'll write employment as a function of beta naught, right, just like before, plus beta SF times whether you're in San Francisco, plus beta LA times whether you're in LA, right, plus beta 2008 times 2008, plus beta 2012, 2012, and then plus what I'll still call beta 3 times whether or not you have a ban-the-box policy in place. Right? So essentially all we've done from the last regression equation to this one is we've added a dummy variable for whether or not you're in Los Angeles. So if we think about how this is going to affect our table here, right, we're still going to say if you're in Houston in 2004, the regression's guess about your employment rate is going to be beta naught, right? And in San Francisco and in LA, it's going to be beta naught plus beta SF, or beta naught plus beta LA. Sorry. Right? In 2008, it's going to be in Houston, beta naught plus beta 2008. In San Francisco and LA, it'll be, well, in San Francisco, it'll be beta naught plus beta SF plus beta 2008 plus beta 3. Why beta 3? Because in San Francisco, by 2008, there was a ban-the-box policy in place, right? So BDB IT will be equal to 1 if you're in San Francisco in 2008. Meanwhile, LA doesn't have a ban-the-box policy yet. So here we'll just have beta naught plus beta LA plus beta 2008. But then in 2012, right, our estimate for Houston is going to be beta naught plus beta 2012. Our estimate for San Francisco, beta naught plus beta SF plus beta 2012 plus beta 3. And our estimate for LA, beta naught plus beta LA plus beta 2012 plus beta 3. So if we think about what's happening here, right? What's happening is, in each year, these coefficients for the year, right, beta 2008 or beta 2012, are going to tell us how the average area, how the average municipality changed, right? It's essentially going to tell us how our control group changed over time, from 2004 to 2008, from 2004 to 2012, right? Meanwhile, our city-specific fixed effects here, the beta LA and the beta SF, are going to pull out the average differences between each of these cities and our control city, right? So San Francisco has persistently higher or persistently lower employment than does Houston. That's going to be picked up by beta SF. And as a result, what's left over, beta 3, is going to tell us how much more employment changed in cities that happen to have ban-the-box in a certain year relative to cities that didn't have ban the box in that year, right? So in 2008, when we go from 2004 to 2008, beta 3 is going to tell us how San Francisco changed relative to two control cities, Houston and LA, neither of which had ban the box. And then from 2008 to 2012, beta 3 is going to tell us how San Francisco and LA, two cities that did have ban the box, changed relative to one control city. So the interpretation of beta 3 is going to be very similar to the interpretation of beta 3 in a normal difference in difference estimation, right? Beta 3 is going to tell us how the cities that have a policy implemented change relative to their controls, relative to the cities that don't have a policy implemented. And the assumption we're going to need to believe that this is the effect of ban the box on employment is going to be exactly the same as in a standard difference in difference. We're going to need a common trends assumption. We're going to need that if ban the box hadn't taken effect, or if it had no effect, the cities that implement ban the box wouldn't have any changes in employment over time that differed from the cities that didn't implement ban the box. So the last thing I want to think about before we move on to results is, if what we need is a common trends assumption, in other words, if we need to assume that cities that implement ban the box would have had similar changes in employment over time, as did cities that didn't implement ban the box, what kinds of problems might lead to a violation of that assumption? So the first set of problems, which we've talked about a little bit, is that the cities that implement ban the box don't look the same as the cities that don't. So in particular, they're much more likely to be large cities, right? Boston, New York, LA, Chicago. These cities implemented ban the box earlier and were more likely to do so than did smaller metro areas. They also have different kinds of demographics than do cities that don't implement ban the box. So cities with a larger fraction of the population that's African American are more likely to implement ban the box, as are cities that have more college educated residents and more high earning residents. So we might be concerned that these cities don't look exactly the same as the cities we're using as control groups. When will that cause a problem? Well, because we're using something akin to a difference in difference strategy, this isn't going to cause a problem if there's persistent differences in employment rates between ban the box cities and non-ban the box cities over time. But it might cause a problem if these two different kinds of cities have different trends in employment over time. And this might be something we particularly worry about given the time period of this data, because most cities that implement ban the box did so from 2010 to 2014, which is to say in the years following the Great Recession, when various economies were coming out of that recession at different speeds. So we might be particularly concerned if, for instance, ban the box cities have larger sectors that were particularly affected by the recession, such as construction industries and banking industries. Now, with all of this, though, what we can do to test these assumptions to see whether we should worry about the cities that implemented ban the box looking different from cities that don't is we can look at whether these cities had changes in employment relative to each other before ban the box went into effect. And the reason that's going to be helpful for thinking about these particular kinds of problems is that while it might be the case that cities that have more Black residents or more college-educated residents or that are larger have different economies than smaller and whiter and less educated cities, it's unlikely that those differences are going to only start causing changes in employment the year that ban the box policies are implemented, especially since these policies are implemented different times in different cities and are sometimes implemented at the state level and other times implemented at the city level. So if these differences in the cities are causing changes in employment, we should expect to see those changes starting before ban the box is implemented and continuing after ban the box is implemented. In other words, we can test our common trends assumption, an assumption about what happens after ban the box is implemented that we can't directly look at by looking at what's called pre-trends, which is to say looking at how these cities change relative to each other before ban the box is implemented. And that's something we can directly test because pre-trends are actually observable. Unfortunately, there's a second set of problems with our common trends assumption that we're not going to be able to test directly by looking at pre-trends. And those are going to be problems associated with governments that ban the box potentially passing other policies as well. Now, the reason we might be concerned about this is because ban the box is a progressive policy priority. In particular, it's a policy priority for people who are concerned about criminal justice reform or concerned about racial justice. And so as a result, we might expect that governments that pass ban the box might pass other elements of a progressive policy agenda as well. And so what we're thinking is an effect of ban the box on employment of of young Black and Hispanic men with low educations might actually be the effect of a broader set of progressive policies on those employment rates. So what might that look like? Well, one thing we might worry about is maybe progressive governments are more likely to regulate certain types of industries, like manufacturing or trucking, that employ a large number of less skilled men. However, if that was the case, we would generally expect that these sorts of regulations would affect white men with low levels of education in a similar way that they affect Black and Hispanic men with low levels of education. And unless these are regulations that specifically target industries that are disproportionately hiring men, we'd expect that they'd also affect women. It's difficult to think of regulations that would only affect the employment of young Black and Hispanic men with low levels of education. So another concern we might have is maybe progressive governments that pass ban the box also take steps to lower incarceration rates. Why would that be a problem? Well, if men that are likely to get incarcerated are also less likely to become employed, essentially when we look at our employment rate, we might be expanding the denominator without expanding the numerator. In other words, we're going to add young Black and Hispanic men who would be incarcerated under a harsher regime, under a less progressive regime, and therefore excluded from employment statistics, might be included in employment statistics because they're not incarcerated. How big of a concern is this? Well, what we can do is we can basically calibrate this. We could say, given the size of the employment changes that we see, which are generally in the line of something like 4 percentage points, how big of a change in incarceration rates would we need? And is that at all plausible as a result of changes in city policies? And given the size of the results we're going to see here, this is a pretty implausible story. Okay, another thing we might worry about, maybe we've got progressive governing policies that we could think of as being soft on crime. In other words, policies that, for instance, are less likely to penalize property crimes or are less likely to protect businesses from potential criminal activity by their employees or by their neighbors. Why would this be a problem? Well, we might think that soft on crime policies could lead businesses to leave relatively high crime neighborhoods, which are more likely to be relatively high in their percentage of Black and Hispanic residents. And so if you've got businesses leaving neighborhoods where young Black and Hispanic men live, this might lower their employment rates. The problem here is, again, why would this only affect young Black and Hispanic men and not older Black and Hispanic men? And why would this affect men but not women? Another possibility here is maybe soft on crime policies just make businesses more concerned about hiring people who might potentially commit crimes. So instead of this being statistical discrimination targeted towards people whose criminal records are unobservable, we might be capturing prejudices against Black and Hispanic men that are heightened as a result of concern about crime. But again, we would have to take seriously the possibility of just how large these soft on crime policies would have to be, just how large these effects would be in order to give us the results that we have. But the important thing here is these sorts of problems are problems that we can't deal with by looking at pre-trends. In other words, we can't rule out these stories by saying that cities that implemented ban-the-box policies had similar changes in employment over time as cities that didn't before they implemented ban-the-box, because these are all things that might have happened after cities implemented ban-the-box. And as a result, in order to think about these assumptions, right, in order to think about these potential violations, we're going to need to go to theory and we're going to need to think critically about what the results would be of each of these stories. So the final point I want to leave you with is, as always, when we think about our common trends assumption, it's a fundamentally untestable assumption, because it's an assumption about what the world would have looked like had a policy not been implemented. Okay, great. So in the next video, we're going to look through what actually happened, what the authors find were the results of ban-the-box policies using these methods.